Is saltwater more difficult? Is it actually a higher tier of fish keeping? You know, everyone you talk to that is a true saltwater keeper, they kind of almost put themselves on a different playing field. And I don't mean to offend anybody, because I'll say there's some differences between saltwater and freshwater, but I still want to know, is saltwater more difficult? So if you've been following my channel for a time, you know that I primarily keep freshwater aquariums. I've done one saltwater in the past. I made it way more complicated than it needed to be. And today I want to start the new reef tank that we're gonna have here in my office, but I still want to get into it. Is saltwater more difficult? That's the note. Like, there's two questions I get asked when people see my tanks. Is number one, is that saltwater? And then number two, isn't saltwater more difficult? And my answer to that, I think, is it's just different. But I want to talk about that as we're setting up this tank today, focusing on what are those differences. Again, like, is saltwater difficult? Well, as we start here, I've got a tank, right? You need a glass box, acrylic box, something that's gonna hold the water. Now, I've chosen a rimless aqua top that's an all-in-one system. Now, what does that mean? That means all the filtration for this tank is just in the back. There's just a nice piece of acrylic that has chambers in the back of this tank that's gonna allow me to put different pieces of equipment. That's all that is. You could do this with a simple 10-gallon tank from Petco, a 20-gallon tank from Petco, get a hang on the back filter, and you can run saltwater. So why is it more difficult? Now, some people are gonna say you have to have a sump to really do things in a reefing. Now, I guess there's levels of keeping, right? There's advanced levels of freshwater keeping, there's advanced levels of reef keeping, but let's focus in on setting up a simple saltwater tank and what makes that so different. So like they say, this is an aqua top tank. I think it's like 18 gallons or something, so it's not a big tank. I like the cube formation of it, and I'm going to be using the stock pump this came with. It's an aqua top pump. It's rated for 475 gallons per hour, so nothing crazy. But like I said though, you can, and like I said, so this all-in-one tank just allows this pump to just sit back here and you're not gonna see it. So I think it comes down to, what do you want? Because you can set up a simple reef tank with a 20-gallon tank and a hang on the back filter. But why does people still think it's so complicated? So if we've established that it's not the tank that makes saltwater hard, and it's not necessarily the pump that makes saltwater hard, because a pump is just moving water, right? We established that a hang on the back filter can do that. Then is it the biological filtration that's gonna make this different? Now I'm gonna say kind of, because right here, the way this tank is set up is there's actually a compartment and these nice containers that slide right in the back of this that are full of just simple ceramic rings. And I'm adding these for extra biological filtration, but that still doesn't seem like it makes it very hard to me. And let me explain. So another part, before we continue our biological filtration discussion, could it be the way we heat the tank? Because I know everybody says that saltwater tanks, you need specific equipment for it, which is true, I would say, but that's a later down the road topic. So maybe it's how we heat the tank. I mean, I do have a Eheim Jaeger heater, a 150 watt heater that I bought from Bulk Reef Supply, that's a reefing company, but I've used this same heater in my freshwater aquariums, right? So it's just a heating element. I mean, I'm gonna set it to roughly 78 degrees, and I'm just gonna sneak it back here into one of these compartments, right? Just something to make it easy. Same suction cups, it's gonna heat the tank as it moves through. So maybe is that the difference? Is it the way we heat? But I just showed you that it's the exact same heater that I've been using in my freshwater aquariums. So if it's not heating differences, we talked a little bit about biological differences. Maybe it's gotta do something with the sand. Now this is kind of towards that biological standpoint, right? And this is a Carib Sea, but I've used Carib Sea products in my freshwater aquariums. The 90-gallon tank, that's Carib Sea. So what makes this different? Well, I think this is kind of where we're gonna get into some differences, but even then, if you're going for a simple reef tank, even just a simple saltwater tank, you know, we'll talk some differences there. is it doesn't have to be this carob sea sand. So I chose this based on the grain size. Now I also chose black. I saw a saltwater tank with black sand and thought it looked absolutely incredible. A lot of people are gonna go for the more natural look, and that's fine. But again, I chose for the grain size. I wanted something that was a little bigger. Again, it's kind of look, and then a lot of times in saltwater tanks, you hear you have to have a high amount of flow in your tank because that's what the fish need. There's some truth to that. But again, for a simple reef tank, or just even I keep saying reef tank, simple saltwater tank, I can turn on this pump and get proper amount of, overturn in the tank, flow in the tank, that I'm gonna be fine. But there's also things that are gonna help like buffer pH and just, buffering qualities for a saltwater tank. So it's not as concerning as it necessarily needs to be. You could do something like crushed coral and be just fine. So I wouldn't necessarily put pool filtration sand in here, right? It's gonna get blown all around, but for some subtle differences, it's still sand. It's still a substrate. It's just, what do you want to do with it? So for a simple saltwater tank, this is very doable. You don't need anything crazy for it. So if it's not the sand that makes this difficult, could it potentially be what we aquascape the tank with? So I would say we're now getting into the first thing that's really different from freshwater to saltwater, and you could leave it at this point and have a very successful saltwater tank, and that's actually the rock that we use in a saltwater tank. Now, what I have here is called dry rock, right? You're often gonna hear you need something called live rock in a saltwater aquarium, which is true. Now, the reason you're gonna hear terms like dry live rock and all these different things, this is called the Reef Saver rock that I purchased from Bulk Reef Supply. It's a man-made rock. But what this is a porous-based rock that has a density to allow bacteria to colonize this. Now, the arguable thing is any hard surface in an aquarium is gonna get colonized by bacteria, right? You have hardscape into a freshwater aquarium, you're going to get a nice bacterial colony on that. But the difference is, this is the main filtration source in a saltwater aquarium. The way that the bacteria colonizes and how it works is you will grow that on this rock, and that acts as your main filtration source. We loaded up some biological rings in the back, but with this rock, this is really where it gets into, allows you to house good bacteria colonies. Now you're gonna cycle a saltwater tank just as you're gonna cycle a freshwater tank, right? It's just gonna take time. Now, I have been letting this quote unquote cycle for over a year. Now what does that mean? That means if you go back to my channel, link a video to it, I built a mixing station and I put this rock into a brute trash can, and I mixed it with a pump, a heater, and some salt water. I threw some bacteria in there, I put some shrimp in there, and I just let it sit. Now I've been sitting on this project for over a year, so I had that time. Now you don't need to do that, right? You don't need to do that to have a successful saltwater tank. I do suggest that you get some nice rock, put it in your tank, let it sit for like a solid month, just marinate that thing, and then let that bacteria colonize. Now it's a little different than, let's say, like a freshwater tank where you're gonna use, wood and rocks and plants to help build up a bacterial colony. We're using this dry rock for that. You can purchase legitimate live rock, but it's very expensive and it can come in with pests. So I chose to go the route of dry rock, so I knew that there was no pests, no contaminants. I gotta control this. Now, I have a bunch of larger pieces and smaller pieces, so we're gonna kind of set up an aquascape in this tank. I mean, you could pile it up and throw fish in it and call it a saltwater tank, because that is a saltwater tank. So the first focus on this is we're gonna set this up to be a saltwater tank with just fish. And we'll start that here in the next few weeks as we get fish into this tank. But let's go ahead and get this set up with the rock and kind of cap it off with the water that you have to add to a saltwater tank, because you think it's self-explanatory, and it kind of is, but there's some details I want to talk about. So now that you've chosen your tank, we've established that there are some subtle differences in the biological filtration and the substrate you're gonna use. You got your pump picked out, whether that be a return pump from a sump, whether that be a canister filter, whether that be a hang on the back filter. Something to move water over your biological filtration is there. We have set up our rock work, and we've got the main basis of the tank set up, right? We're in the kind of the home stretch to having this done, have you? But we're missing one key component we're missing two key components. I take that back. We're missing two key components here. That's going to be the lighting and the water for the tank. But let's start with lighting. Now, anytime anybody comes to me and asks me for assistance in setting up a tank, even on a freshwater side, I've consulted on a few saltwater builds, but I'm not a pro at this by any means. I'm not a reefing channel, but there are ideas that I do believe though that cross over between freshwater and saltwater. And the main basis that I ask people when they ask me what light should I buy for my tank, I ask a couple simple questions. One, what are your plans for the tank? Meaning, do you plan on growing plants if you're doing freshwater? Do you plan on growing coral if you're saltwater? Or do you just want to see your fish? Now, based on that answer, if you just want to see your fish, there's much cheaper options that you can use on a freshwater tank, on a saltwater tank. You know, the saltwater tank side, can have a little more blue to it because that makes a lot of the colors of the fish really pop. And on the freshwater side, you can use something as simple as like a LED T5 shop light, you know, something very basic. But there's those basic options on both sides. Now, if you want to grow plants on a freshwater side, I would recommend something like a Finnex Stingray. You know, you get into the fluval lights. Now, if you want to grow coral on a reef tank side, that saltwater side, that's where some differences come in. I feel like if you just want to set up a saltwater tank that we have right here, put a light, you can put any light on this to view your fish. Now, if you want to make it a true reef tank and grow coral, there are some differences in lights that I feel are going to help you actually succeed in growing those coral. So the light that I've picked out to use on this tank, I feel crosses over onto both sides. If you just want a nice looking tank that's very sleek, very fashionable, designer-esque, or if you want to grow some coral, I've chosen the Aqua Illumination HD Prime. Now this is the 16, I think, this is the AI 16. Ugh, I gotta look at this here. AI Prime HD. I think it has like 16 LED lights in it. Now, as this time, this is the older model. There is a newer version that has come out that I think is a better LED combo kind of thing. I actually purchased mine used from a local hobbyist that was breaking down a tank. But these are available on Amazon. They're available on Bulk Reef Supply. That's where I do most of my shopping. If I'm going the saltwater side, it's gonna be Bulk Reef Supply. Now, Bulk Reef Supply has done some incredible reviews talking about this light. They have a dedicated YouTube channel for that. My other go-to reefing channel is going to be Fish of Hex. Does some great things, and both of them have shown that you can grow coral with the Aqua Illumination HD Prime. You know, it's a very small, compact LED light, and I don't plan on growing any insane corals in this tank. I do want to get coral in this tank, but even if you wanted to set up just a nice, simple reef tank, a nice, simple saltwater tank, the Aqua Illumination light will do well for this. Now, I have to say, the other person I feel has shown setting up a simple saltwater tank is Tazawa Tanks. He's done some nice, simple builds that really focus more on the fish than the coral. And I think that's a great entry point for so many hobbyists, is they're so afraid of doing saltwater because so many people say it's difficult. But along building this tank, we've established that it's not that difficult. It just depends on what you want to do. If you want a saltwater tank, this could be a saltwater tank. So we're gonna get this light hooked up here on this tank and move into the next portion, the kind of the final portion, and that's gonna be water. So now I would say we're in the fun part of the build. That's where you actually get water in the tank. Now your mind starts thinking of what fish you wanna add, everything else you wanna do with the tank. But like I said though, I think this is the deciding factor if saltwater is hard or difficult compared to freshwater. Now, I'm fortunate I have my own water filtration system called an RODI unit, reverse osmosis direct is it deionization, however you want to pronounce it. What that does is it strips everything out of the water to make it as clean as water source as possible. All minerals, all chlorine, everything in that water to give me the most pure water that I can start with. The reason I do that is when I mix in the salt, that salt's gonna bring back the minerals, bring back the elements that I need to add into a saltwater tank, right? And now this is where I would say this is where saltwater gets difficult. Is it the fact of you actually have to mix your own saltwater? Freshwater, oftentimes you just dechlorinate, you really don't think about it, you're not chasing numbers very much. I'm gonna say the same thing here on saltwater. You're not necessarily chasing numbers, but you have to measure your salt out to a certain salinity. That's the salt content in that water. Now there's tools to measure the salt content in your water, and I have one that's a digital, it's called a refractometer. What this allows me to do is I will load a set amount, it's a drop of water on here. I can look through the system here and measure how much salt is in the water. Now there's good, better, best options to measure the salinity. What I have is kind of on the cusp of better, kind of good. But I see this is where it gets difficult, is the fact you actually have to mix water. It's like when you want to do a water change, most times what people will do is fill a 5-gallon bucket up with RODI water, you know, that clean water source, mix in the set amount of salt, put in a power head, let it mix overnight, do their water change. Now I'm fortunate I've built an entire system to where I can mix up like 20 gallons of water, have it on hand, but that's where it gets difficult. Now you can go the route of buying water from a local fish store. Many local fish stores will actually have RODI water on hand. They'll have pre-mixed salt water on hand, but you don't know necessarily how clean that water is per se because you're not the one controlling it. But it's not a bad way to start. I've seen people do saltwater tanks on like well water. You know, if you're not looking to necessarily do coral, they'll just do a saltwater tank, add their live rock into it, cycle it, add some fish in here, and just have a very beautiful tank of a fish-only system. You know, we use this live rock, or the dry rock have you make it live rock, in a way of that biological filtration. But I think the most difficult part of this, if you want to really keep this a simple thing, is going to be mixing the salt water. Now, salt mixes, there are so many across the board. Find one that fits your budget. Again, Bulk Reef Supply has done some incredible testing breaking down certain components of each salt. But for our basis here, this is the beginnings to a very simple saltwater tank. And you know, now when people ask me, is that a reef tank? Is that a saltwater tank? I can answer yes. So guys, thank you so much for joining me on this. Let me know down in the comment section below. Have you kept saltwater? Do you think it's difficult? Does this make you want to keep saltwater? Did this answer questions you have? So always curious to hear what you guys are working on. Again, thank you so much for joining me. We'll talk to you guys in the next one.